Woohoo! Hang on to your hats. We are getting ready to jump into biochemistry, and the fun starts now. Okay, if I can roll this up. Okay, here we go. All right, so if we start at the very smallest, we're looking at matter. And matter is anything that's going to take up space and it has a mass to it. And so takes up space, it has mass, and then the next, when we go up larger to that, then we have what's called an element, and it's written, here's the element name, and then it's written in this chemical symbol. So when we look at an element, notice this one has a capital letter and a lowercase letter. If the capital letter denotes the element, and then the lowercase letter, if there is a lowercase, that means that that lowercase goes with the uppercase. If there was another one, like if this was a capital C and a capital O, then that would be a compound. Those are two different elements, but the lowercase goes with the actual element. And the element itself has the simplest form of a substance that can't be broken apart. And it's still going to have those same properties. So it's the smallest unit there in order to maintain those specific properties. Then we can have what's called a compound. A compound is just like the word says, you're compounding things together. So in this case, if we took sodium, and the chemical symbol for that is Na, and chlorine, the chemical symbol for that is Cl, and you put those two together. Notice Na is lowercase with the N, the A is, and so that's sodium and chlorine here. You put those together and you get a salt. You get table salt, and that's what sodium chloride is. That's a compound. This is where you have two or more, you can have more, but two or more elements that are bonded together, and they result in a new chemical. And that new chemical has all entirely different properties from what the individual. So sodium chloride has different chemical properties than sodium does and chlorine does. An example of it is water. Water is H2O. Sometimes it can be it's a stable liquid, and sometimes it can be used to put out fire, but hydrogen itself is flammable, it's explosive, and oxygen is also flammable, but you put it together and you can actually put out fire with it. All right. Okay, moving on here, schnapps. Now, that's a saying that we use in order to look at the elements that are the most common elements that are found in all life forms. All right. So that's C. You can see what all these stand for: carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. So that's what the letters here all stand for. Those are the most abundant and the most common in all life forms. Now there's other ones on this chart here. They're called trace elements. You can see it even talks about them down here. Trace elements, those are still humans still require, or living things require them, they need them, but they're only present in very small amounts. They're not present in large amounts. All right, so the acronym to remember that is CHNOPS, and when you remember CHNOPS, you remember the elements that are important. Well, important for living things, the essential, in large quantities for living things. All right, now moving on, we're moving into atoms. All right, so atoms and subatomic particles. Notice sub is in red. It's a prefix, and it is below. Sub means below. So you're talking about atoms and the particles that are smaller than an atom. So in one atom, you're going to have electrons, these negative charged electrons. You're going to have protons, which are positive charge, and you're going to have neutrons, which have a neutral charge. And so you're going to have all three of these subatomic particles that make up an atom. All right, so let me stick here just for a moment. So the protons have a positive charge. The proton and the neutrons have a neutral charge. They have no charge. And these together, these two are located in the nucleus of the atom. The electron has a negative charge, and that's found outside in what's called the electron cloud. So the number of electrons will equal your number of protons. This is an important concept. Your protons equal your electrons in a neutral atom. So when there's no charge to an atom, the protons equal the neutrons. All right, I'm sorry, the protons equal the electrons. Let me get that right. Whew. All right, so that's a neutral in a neutral atom. Let's see, what else do I want to say about this? Well, let's just move on. All right, now isotopes, how we get isotopes is just what it says here. This is differing the number of neutrons. This is changing the number of neutrons. So protons and electrons equal one another in a neutral atom, but remember we said the protons and neutrons are in the nucleus. Well, they don't necessarily are going to equal each other. And you can have a differing number of these neutrons. If you change the number of neutrons, you still have that same element, but you're going to have what's called an isotope. Now the proton itself is what defines the element. This is really important. The proton is called the atomic number, and it defines that number of protons, defines that atomic number. Defines that element. So you look at the atomic number is the number of protons, and that tells you, like carbon, the atomic number is 6, that tells me it has 6 protons. That cannot change. You can't change it. If you change the number of protons, you change the element, but you can change the number of electrons and get an ion, and you can change the number of neutrons and get an isotope. How exciting, huh? All right, so if you change it, you can see here carbon 12 is the atomic number, the atomic mass, that's the number of protons plus neutrons. All right, so here we have carbon 13. Well, remember carbon still has 6 protons, so what's changed is the number of neutrons. So carbon 13 now has 7 neutrons, and carbon 14 now has 8 neutrons. Carbon 14, you can see 12 is stable, 13 is stable. When you get to carbon 14, this is unstable, it's radioactive. And so when we say that something is radioactive, you're working with an unstable isotope of that element. And we use carbon 14 for dating and various different things, tracers that you can use carbon 14 for that radioactivity. All right, let's see. Ions, I mentioned that if you change the number of electrons, you get what's called an ion. Now, remember I said the protons equal the electrons. So sodium, if you looked up sodium on the periodic table, sodium is going to have it's going to have 11 protons. In a neutral atom, that means it's going to have 11 electrons. So if it has 11 neutrons and 11 electrons, it is, that's neutral, but it's not happy. And let me define happy. Having the outer shell, the outermost electron shell, makes an atom happy. So in the first shell, there are 2 electrons, and you fill it up in order of the shell. So we said that there would be 11 electrons to start with. So here's 2 in the first shell. The next shell can hold 8. So we filled up 2, but we still have 9 more. So we fill up 8 in this outer shell. So now we have a total of 10. So we're going to put in 1 in that outer shell. Well, think about it. If you have a party and you're the only one there, it's not really a party, is it? You want to have that shell filled up. You want it full. So what happens is that because there's only 1, that electron wants to leave and go find another party. And so that electron is going to leave and go somewhere else, and we'll look at some examples of when it leaves, what happens. But notice that when it leaves, the next level is now full. So that lower level is now full. So if we had 11 protons and 11 electrons, 11 pluses and 11 minuses give us 0 if we add those together. And that's neutral. But now we have 10 electrons and 11 protons, so 11 pluses and 10 minuses, so that's where we get the plus charge. We have a +1 charge because now we have more protons than we have electrons. All right. Atoms found on the periodic table, there's different energy levels. You can see in the first shell, see these two in the first shell. Then we have, when we start in on the second shell, so lithium has 3 protons. That means it's going to have 3 electrons. And that third electron goes out here, and you can see as these fill up, you're filling up that second shell. And then here is the third shell. Once that second shell is filled with 8, then we move out here to the third shell. All right. This is just showing you the orbitals, how the electrons circle the nucleus. We're not going to really go into a whole lot with the shapes of the electrons, just so you see what those end up looking like. So once you have the second shell and how those end up looking the same. All right, so now if we have a molecule with the same element, all right, so here's oxygen, it's O2, there's 2 molecules of oxygen, and so here's our first shell, it has 2, notice both of them have 2 in the first shell. The second shell is supposed to have 8. Well, oxygen's not going to have 8 in its outer shell, so it's going to bond. In this case, this is called a covalent bond, and so they're sharing these electrons. But notice there's 2 electrons here. 2 electrons correspond, 1 line corresponds to 2 electrons. So now we have 4 that they're bonding together, so that's why you end up with what's called a double bond here. So oxygen is double bonded through this covalent sharing of electrons. All right, so here's molecules of the same element, but molecules of a different element, they can also share electrons. So you can see, but you see how they end up differently. We call water, this is water, and it has this kind of property where those hydrogens will go at different directions. We call this a polar molecule, and we call this the Mickey Mouse molecule, because if we flipped it over, it would look like Mickey Mouse if we drew eyes, nose, and a mouth. All right, the periodic table of elements, with the periodic table, and we'll blow this up in class and we'll take a look, but the periodic table here, this number that's in the upper left-hand corner, that's your atomic number. Remember, we said atomic number is the number of protons. And then the atomic mass is down here below. And that atomic mass is the number of protons plus the number of neutrons. Okay? All right, so if we blew up one of the squares, we're going to look at here. 8, oxygen, the O is for oxygen, that's the chemical symbol. The 8 is telling us that it has 8 protons. That's what makes it oxygen. And this number here at the bottom is our atomic mass. That's the number of protons plus neutrons. So 8, atomic number, number of protons. 16, number of atomic mass, number of protons and neutrons. So how many neutrons would we have here? If we have 8 protons and we have 16 total, we would just take 16 minus 8, and that tells us the number of neutrons. All right, and we already talked about radioactive isotopes. Most isotopes are radioactive. They have, like I said, they have a different number of neutrons than they have of the number of protons and neutrons. The number of neutrons differ with an isotope, and seems like I was going to tell you something else about these, but I can't really, I don't know. Well, oh, they normally have the same chemical properties as the normal element, but the physical properties may be slightly different. All right, that's all we have for our program today, kids. Be good and wear your seatbelts.